It is, before that, my incredible pleasure to welcome to the stage Robyn Williams. Now, as you would already know, Robyn is one of Australia's leading science journalists and broadcasters, as well as being an official national living treasure. I don't know if you get a badge for that. He's probably best known as the presenter of ABC's The Science Show, but he has also worked on programs such as Quantum, Catalyst, The Nature of the Australia series, appeared in World Safari with David Attenborough, just name dropping there. Outside the ABC, Robyn has been president of the Australian Museum Trust, chairman of the Commission for the Future, and president of the Australian Science Communicators. Please welcome to the stage Robyn Williams.
Thank you, what an honour. In fact, a skeptic in South Australia used to be in the ABC with me, Paul Willis, called me correctly a national living fossil. As you'll hear when you go to listen to this week's programme. Misinformation, we've heard a lot about it so far in this conference, and one worry one has as science gets more and more thinned out is how much of the good work they can still do. There was something in the Economist magazine, which is, I think, one of the best carriers of science of any magazine, popular magazine in the world. They once had some amazing figure for the number of years, academic years, that scientists have to spend filling in forms and applying for basic money to do their work. It's ridiculous. So it's not surprising that some aspects of science are a bit shaky. Two examples for heading of misinformation. Sydney Morning Herald on the 22nd of October. Headline, 1 in 7 science papers can't be trusted, says new science paper. Which I rather like. And it's all about a Swedish gentleman who published a paper and showed that there are problems with other science not being peer-reviewed properly, and so there's a figure based on a simple averaging of 12 other studies of misconduct is meant more as a warning of the potential scale of the problem which the James Heathers, I think he's a professor, a doctor in Sweden, believes is a systemic. Now, this article was written by Liam Mannix, who's a very good science journalist. So it's a matter of concern that appeared. And in the same week, in the New Scientist, getting the facts right. There is a dirty secret in publishing. Most popular science books aren't fact-checked. Readers deserve better, says Michael Marshall. On it goes. The difficulty is with actually getting things out. Just the first paragraph. Non-fiction publishing is failing its readers. It is pumping out books with supposedly game-changing ideas without bothering to ensure basic accuracy. These tomes have the appearance of academic work, but none of the rigour. My frustration, says the author, about this has been building for years and finally exploded when I reviewed Yuval Noah Harari's book, Nexus, which is full of ill-supported nonsense, including a hopelessly incoherent definition of the concept of information. So on it goes. I read articles like that nearly all the time. We have misinformation because most aspects, good or bad, are stretched. And it's so easy to mislead people. And what I'm here to talk about today is how I purposely misled people at length over some of the early years of the science show. The reason was quite worthy, actually. You see, before I joined the ABC, I'd spent some time at the University of London and at the same time doing work on television, such as the early years of Monty Python, The Goodies, and with a fairly young man then called Spike Milligan. Spike was a very cross fellow, and I was delighted to find that he was a listener later on when he joined his mother in Woy Woy. She always listened to the science show. But when I was working with him in London, he would do things like have a number of us do strange things. My job, on the last one I can remember, is dressed as a Grenadier Guardsman, marching, carrying a cup of tea through a pseudo brick wall. And it was very strange doing rehearsals with him because he was just so cross about management and was saying, it's such invective. But then when the live audience came in, he was a honey. Just completely different. So sweet. But with the Python people, it was quite interesting to see and hear how serious they were. Because Cleese always called himself as interesting as a country solicitor. And when I went to his house, I understood it because instead of a ceiling, he had a parachute. And my 2 teenage children were with me and said, why does he have a parachute up there? Yes, he likes parachutes. And then we went to see Graham Chapman, who, of course, played the Messiah so brilliantly, except as someone said, his mother, supposedly in the film, he's not the Messiah, he's just a very naughty boy. And I went there to interview him, and he was slightly lame from too much filming somewhere in North Africa. And so I made a cup of tea, and my teenage kids were still with me at the time. And I said, Graham, would you like some sugar? He said, no, I'm gay. And that's the kind of sideways humour that they had, which was language-based, and my kids fell over laughing. It worked. So what I decided to do when I became a science broadcaster is actually turn it on its head, excuse me, and have skepticism for science from the listener. And it began, I think, somewhere around 1974, when I was doing a program called Insight. And it was coming up for the 500th program, and so I thought I'd have someone really, really special on. But they'd had all the special people, Mark Oliphant, some McFarlane Burnett, and various other names you might remember from way back. So I decided what I would do is write a very famous, not yet famous, but someone who would fit the occasion. So I wrote about Sir Clarence Lovejoy, who was the expert on brain flux theory, which was the sort of thing that they were talking about in science, where we are just robots and it was just a computer up there and this is a connection and you behave automatically, and in other words they're devaluing humanity. So I decided that Sir Clarence Lovejoy had to be someone who was ultra that kind of robotic theory about human beings. I wrote a script, I sent it to Barry Humphries. He immediately phoned me up in the morning and said, love to do it. And his agent phoned in the afternoon and said, you talked to Barry before lunch, didn't you? Wasn't going to happen. So I got in touch instead, just across the road, with Fred May, who was the leading person from the Sydney University Dramatic Society, brilliant professor, both of philosophy and Italian, who could riff with words. And the whole point about doing satire is you don't just do words, you have to have the person in character, otherwise it doesn't work. So we recorded it, and he did the most wonderful riffs around the language. And much to my astonishment, on the Monday, this program was on the Sunday, we got an invite to go on the Mike Walsh show together. So we turned up and were asked very serious questions about the basic theory that we were promulgating, that many people with their brains were reduced in capacity in insufficient megalomania. And we gave a list of the politicians in Australia who were lacking megalomania. Gough Whitlam wasn't. he was fine. And we romped around town talking this wonderful bullshit, smiling away. And I suddenly realised, if you was on the radio and you said it was science, you'd get away saying anything. And I thought, when I started the science show, I actually repeated that piece with Sir Clarence Lovejoy. You see, the idea was that he was in the laboratory. He'd had 2 Nobel Prizes. He was amazingly qualified. And he was actually flirting with Gertrude in the lab. And he then saw a brat with his brain exposed there on the bench. And he broke off with Gertrude and said, "Have you got a hat pin?" And she said, "Well, I have," and took it out and gave it to him. And he went over to the rat, which is still alive, of course, and pointed it right deep into the pons ponderosus, which is the seat of pondering. And the rat folded its arms and began to think. And then into the lobus levitatis, the seat of humour, and it started to laugh. Absolute proof, we said on national television. And anyway, the ultimate thing you have to do with satire is to make it bloody obvious so that people do not feel they're being humiliated or in any way take it too seriously. So that became a tradition after the first 100th science show. I decided to do it every 2 years, as it turns out, there being 52 weeks in a year. The next one was the fossil beer can, which turned out to be 100,000 years old. And I had made the wonderful acquaintanceship of someone who's always been my hero, love him dearly, the late John Clarke. I phoned him first of all in New Zealand when he was being Fred Dagg, the farmer. I recognised the genius once listening to the Bob Hudson show. And all he was doing was just wandering around the farmyard, just rounding up whichever animal it was, and improvised in the most brilliant way. So I phoned him up and said, "You and I have got to be co-conspirators." Anyway, the main thing we did after a number of little bits here and there was the fossil beer can, in which he played this Scottish, strangely enough, he chose to be a Scottish person, who found the beer can somewhere way out in the red centre and knew enough about it and dating it to find out it was unbelievably old, long before humans were supposed to have come here, because when I first arrived in Australia, it was supposed to be 4,000 years ago, would you believe? And so we went to the University of New South Wales, where Professor Jack Kelly, Professor of Physics, got a beer can and monstered it for us as if it was of that age. And we had lots of photos taken of us, and we had it exhibited in the atrium of the Australian Museum. And there was complaints from the Teetotal Society that we were encouraging grog. I also, of course, announced that this was the possession of some of the first people here, long before Indigenous people as recognised, and this was Homo micturans, or pissed person. And when the beer was finished, chucked it over his or her shoulder, and then from the provenance of the beer can, you could work out which direction the creature was going. And obviously it was walking backwards to Europe, which showed a reversal of the normal ideas of population. And so that went out quite happily. And then we had, 2 years after that, the case of the royal birth, which I did 3 months in advance of the actual occasion. The point is, there's always a point. Now, obviously, in the fossil beer can, we were trying to suggest that human beings and their provenance was so much more mysterious than anyone imagined. with the royal birth, this celebrated another aspect of real science. Alan Trounson had showed that you could have frozen embryos, and that occurred at a time when Charles and Diana were going all around the Commonwealth, and no one could work out quite why. And so I decided to provide an answer. Now, what they were doing, because huge debate was on about republicanism in this, for some reason, Australians, all of you love the idea that your head of state is somewhere on the other side of the planet. And when you meet this person, you do all sorts of bobbing up and down and such like. I can never understand it, but of course, being from the ABC, I have no opinion about such things. But anyway, I worked out, obviously, if you look carefully at the evidence, that what they were doing was, having done something biological, they were now leaving frozen embryos in fridges in every part of the Commonwealth. Every government house had a frozen embryo, so that you could eventually have someone who is indigenous of your country, but still royal. And then the physiological question was, at what point does royalty enter the tissues? And we thought the most obvious thing was at orgasm, which raised the question as to whether royalty had orgasms, which itself turned out to be a real question later, as you know. So we were exposed. I don't have any slides, but I have this one. ABC uproar, royal birth a fake. That came out on the Sunday after the science show. They'd already been in touch with them, and Buckingham Palace officially said, no comment. And the press went running to ABC headquarters, and Leonie Kramer happened to be chair of the board. Leonie Kramer, in some ways, likened to Margaret Thatcher. And what did you think? You know, this terrible behaviour. And her answer was, we thought it was rather well done. Tony Baldwin did these wonderful low tones, you know, the description of ways in which the palace was getting ready for the great occasion. You had public broadcasts done on the street with shouts of Thatcher out of the people protesting again. We had John Clark playing another aspect. He did some farnarkling commentary. You know, he invented this wonderful sport, which was completely bogus. And then when we had some sort of result, eventually it got repeated. And it was quite stunning, because it was done in goodwill. There was nothing sneering or snide about it. And to some extent, I was aware of the nature of humour, which these days has become, shall we say, bilious. You know, some of the cartoons in the Australian newspaper done by Johannes Leek, his father, after his accident, was marking the course, where you can barely, it's not funny, it's just bilious. And the sort of politics we have, the tribal politics, are going the same way. So what's the point of all this? It seemed to me, when I was starting the science show, that what you heard about von Däniken, Uri Geller on the cover of the New Scientist at one stage, could something be going on that, or what was the nature of the reaction to all of the misleading material going around? And I continued some of the satire going on until I, in advance of AI, did something with Ronald Reagan in his activities, which I thought was terribly clever at the time, but regretted afterwards. I got extracts from many of his speeches and interviews, cut them up, interpolated my questions, such as, is it true you dye your hair? And which brand do you prefer? And does your wife always go to sessions to get some sort of spiritual advice on what your policy should be about? And it just didn't work, because it was obviously how it was being done, and it seemed to be on that road to Snydery. So what we've got instead is a world now where we're broadcasting, you have to be extremely careful about what you're saying, whether you're having fun or not. You've got to be so careful, because so many of the experiments are now cancelled. I've been edited a few times. I'll give you some examples at the dinner if you like. But what do you make of all this? It seems to me that what we've got is a situation now where those who are making an industry of misinformation are isolating people who are thoughtful, who are concerned about the future, and science is above all an element of the future like almost no other. Because what we're doing, what the scientists are doing, I'm just a journalist, is looking for answers to questions where we don't know the answers and the evidence is not known yet. So everything there is in the future. Everything then has to be somehow supported, not in a way that's become the fashion in some countries like Britain and here, stop, start, and then you eliminate, in many instances, the start. This is really an incredibly difficult way to do science. So what do you do about that sort of situation? Well, obviously, it's the sort of thing that the people in Canberra know only too well, and the chief scientist, Alan Finkel, when he was chief scientist, said, okay, you go and see the minister, don't let your first question be, can we have more money? Because everyone asks that. Secondly, go and be a representative of a larger group, not just you and your particular line of investigation in isolation, because they're used to that. And what you've got to do above all is to convince the young people, especially young men, may I say, that taking notice of science and getting to understand it is so bloody important. Very few of the young men actually listen to our programs, and we've got several left, and we've got lots and lots of online stuff. But the evidence is few of them. Many young women do, and it's quite extraordinary, because they get in touch. One got in touch with me this morning, someone who was a year ago in search of a person who could advise her on geological work connected with outer space, would you believe? And I gave her a connection. And she said that 5-minute conversation led to a complete change in my career. So there is a situation which I've tried to influence by making science a matter of what people do. And I've had, and this is probably a bit naughty, a top 100 Australian scientists. And the good thing is that I keep having to add to it. But when I ask folk what they know about scientists or people behind science, they look at me puzzled. Sometimes I can't think of a single name. Many people say, oh, Einstein. An Australian scientist? Are you kidding? And I ask them, for instance, little questions such as Brisbane. Okay, the World Science Festival is on in March. It's in Brisbane. Who was Brisbane? You know? Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm at home. Of course, he was an astronomer. And he was a governor of New South Wales. And he came here, and this is the point, and this is the point of my program today. He looked up at the sky, and he saw a completely different view of the cosmos. Down here is different, and it's spectacularly and wonderfully different. And what we were doing today in a program, actually from the Australian Museum, which is the second oldest institution in science in Australia, the oldest being the Botanic Gardens, 1816, and the Museum, 1827. There they went to one of the places where one of the 20,000 or 22 million specimens, zillions of them anyway, and they opened not a drawer, but a small safe, and in it were 9 pieces, quite large pieces, of opal. And suddenly the scientists realized that these were fossils of creatures they'd never known before. And today we interviewed them, one of them being Tim Flannery, another being the head of research at the Australian Museum, Chris Helgen. And the message is, mammals evolved in Australia. Not just monotremes, and there was an age of monotremes. And that sort of evolution overturns the preconception of some of the scientists we've talked to about. For instance, dinosaurs, and American people would say in museums up there, why don't you have any dinosaurs in Australia? It's just so uninteresting. Now we're finding the opposite. And people who are, as we've heard so far today at this conference, misled by all the nonsense that's promulgated, are missing the real wonderful story. Because it's so, as Brisbane found, Brisbane, having seen the sky, he then set up in Parramatta, and it's still there. Anyone been there to Parramatta, the first observatory in this country? Well done. Lots of things are unknown to people about this astounding history. Birdsong was invented here. There was another drawer in a museum in Victoria where, okay, they were ordinary whale bones, standard stuff, quite large, but nothing, And someone said, have we dated them? And they hadn't. And the result was that these bones were 50 million years older than anyone imagined. Again, whales, giant whales, came from here. How come? Because here was part of Gondwana, this giant continent where so much was available. And I find it terribly sad that some of the bullshit that's coming around is distracting from the real story, which is so intriguing and true and testable. Who knows? The story about mammals may be not quite right. But as Tim Flannery said today, there's so much wonderful paleontology still to do. Wouldn't it be absolutely tremendous if we could get some renewal on our campuses instead of having closure time after time? As we started slightly late, I eked 3 more minutes than I should, but I will answer any questions you like for as long as I'm allowed after that rave. Anyone got one over there?
Robyn, this is about a report that you did that has been stuck with me for decades. And it must have been one of your jokes, but it was about Antarctic rodents burrowing through penguins. Do you remember this report? Tell me it's not true.
Gay penguins, did you say?
No, gay penguins I'm fine with. No, this was Antarctic rodents that burrowed up through the penguins and hollowed them out.
Did I do that?
You! Now everybody in this room is like, what?
No, we did something the last time we did penguins. We found that there's a book published about there being 1,500, at least, different species which show gay behaviour. Especially giraffes, would you believe? You know, but the penguins especially, because they're dressed for it. You know, there's nice black suits. But I didn't hear about the rats going up and burying them. But I'll check it.
You talk about trustworthy science papers, but Retraction Watch has demonstrated a vast increase in retractions of science papers. Comment?
Retractions are the essence of good science as well. And an example of that is Matthew Bale, who has just been nominated, well, he's just won the prize, the Prime Minister's Prize for Science this year, just a few weeks ago. And 10 years back, he was one of the people who had announced for the first time in history that they'd found an exoplanet. But it turned out that the computer or something, one of the machines, gave them the wrong information. And he went through hell as a young man announcing that they were retracting it, and sorry about that. And when I interviewed him, he was shattered, of course, for a long time. He turned around and did the work again, and I don't know whether you realise this, but we now have the Queen, the Australian Queen of exoplanets. She's actually based at Caltech, and I think she's discovered 60. And Matthew Bales is one of our heroes. But retractions happen all the time, and it seems to me the pace at which people, and one of the things I quoted was, there are too many papers because you need to slice the salami more and more, and you get qualifications still, even though they go through various contortions to show that you don't need simply notches on the stick, but that's how you get promotion, I'm afraid.
Can I ask one more question, just a quick question actually? You talk about retractions. Someone once suggested you should have a learned journal devoted to failed experiments, to save everyone else the problem of actually repeating something that didn't work. Everyone else said, no, you've got to have good news experiments that still don't work.
If you can publish with failed experiments, yes. I'm also very fond of the Ig Nobel, prizes, where they have their magazine listing irreproducible science, which Mark Abrahams produces. And it seems, having a philosophy of first to make you laugh and then to make you think makes it worthwhile. But Tim, you're quite right. Thank you very much. Oh, there's one more.